She was the kind of girl most people never noticed. Every morning, she walked through the school gate with her head slightly down, her steps quiet, almost careful, as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. Her uniform was always neat but clearly worn from years of use. The edges of her sleeves were slightly faded, and her shoes had been polished so many times that the leather had started to crack. Still, she took pride in looking presentable. Her home was not far from the school, but the walk felt longer on days when her mind was heavy. She lived with her mother in a small house that stood at the end of a narrow street. The roof sometimes leaked during the rainy season, and the walls carried marks of time, but inside, it was clean and warm. Her mother worked long hours doing small jobs, trying her best to provide what little she could. There wasn't much space in the house, and there certainly wasn't room for luxuries. There was no television, no fancy furniture, and definitely no musical instruments. But there was something else. Something quiet, something growing inside the little girl that no one could see. At school, she sat in the back of the class. Not because she was told to, but because it felt easier that way. From there, she could observe everything without being noticed. She listened carefully to her teachers, always understanding more than she showed. When questions were asked, she knew the answers, but she rarely raised her hand. It wasn't that she didn't want to speak. It was just that she wasn't used to being heard. Most students didn't pay attention to her. Some didn't even know her name. She wasn't part of any group, didn't join in loud conversations, and never tried to stand out. During breaks, while others laughed and ran around, she often found a quiet corner to sit alone. But there was one place in the school where she felt different. The old music room. It wasn't a place many students visited. The door creaked when opened, and the windows were often dusty. Inside, there were a few broken chairs, a shelf with scattered papers, and in the center of the room stood an old piano. Its surface was scratched, and some keys had lost their shine. A few notes sounded slightly off, but it was still standing, still holding on to its purpose. The first time she entered that room, it wasn't intentional. She had been walking through the hallway during lunch break, trying to avoid the noise outside. The door to the music room was slightly open, and something about it caught her attention. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper. She pushed the door gently and stepped inside. First, she only looked around. Her eyes slowly moved across the room until they stopped at the piano. She had seen pictures of pianos before, but never this close. It looked both beautiful and lonely at the same time. She walked toward it carefully, almost as if she needed permission. Her fingers hovered above the keys for a moment before she finally pressed one. A soft sound filled the room. She froze. Then she pressed another key. And another. Each note felt like a small discovery, like opening a door she didn't know existed. The sounds were simple, but they stayed in her mind. She didn't know how long she stood there, just pressing keys one by one, listening, remembering. That day, something changed. After that, the music room became her quiet escape. Every day during lunch, while others rushed outside, she slipped into that room. At first, she only played random notes, but slowly she began to notice patterns. She remembered melodies she had heard somewhere, on the street, from passing radios, from distant weddings, and tried to recreate them. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes the notes didn't match. Sometimes she had to try again and again. But she never gave up. Her fingers started to move more naturally. Her ears became sharper, able to catch small differences in sound. Without realizing it, she was teaching herself. No one guided her. No one corrected her. It was just her, the piano, and the quiet space between them. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The girl who once hesitated to touch the keys now played with growing confidence. Her movements were still gentle, but there was something else now, something stronger beneath the surface. She didn't talk about it to anyone, not even her mother. At home, there was no piano, so she practiced in her mind. She would tap her fingers lightly on the table, imagining the keys. She would close her eyes and replay the sounds she had created earlier in the day. Every note stayed with her, like a secret she carried everywhere. One evening, her mother noticed her tapping fingers. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. The girl smiled a little and shook her head. Nothing. Her mother didn't press further. She was too tired, and the girl had always been quiet. But if she had listened closely, she might have heard a rhythm in those soft taps. A rhythm that didn't come from nowhere. Back at school, the music room remained mostly unnoticed by others. Sometimes a teacher would pass by, but no one paid much attention to what the girl was doing inside. To them, it was just an unused room with an old instrument. They didn't know. They didn't see. They didn't hear. One afternoon, while she was playing, she tried something new. Instead of repeating a melody she had heard before, she let her fingers move freely. The notes came out differently, unexpected yet beautiful. She paused, surprised, then tried again. This time, the sound felt deeper, more real. She didn't have words for it, but she felt it. For the first time, she wasn't just copying music. She was creating it. Her heart beat a little faster as she continued. The room seemed quieter than ever, as if it was listening to her. Each note carried a piece of her emotions, her silence, her thoughts, her dreams. She didn't realize how special it was. To her, it was just something she loved. But outside that room, life remained the same. She was still the quiet girl in the back of the class. Still the one no one noticed. Still the one who walked home alone. Yet inside her, something powerful was growing. Something that would not stay hidden forever. And somewhere, without knowing it, the world was slowly moving toward a moment when her quiet talent would be seen. When her hidden gift would no longer remain a secret. But for now, she was just a little girl, sitting in an old music room, playing a worn-out piano, lost in a world that belonged only to her. The days at school continued in their usual quiet rhythm, but something was slowly changing behind the scenes. The annual school event was approaching, and this year the teachers wanted everything to be perfect. Important guests were expected to attend, including people from other schools and a few well-known figures from the town. It was not just another event. It was a chance for the school to show its best side. For weeks, preparations filled the air. Classrooms buzzed with activity. Students practiced dances. Speeches were written and rewritten. And decorations slowly began to take shape across the campus. Teachers moved quickly from one task to another, their voices sharper than usual, their expectations higher. Among all these preparations, one performance stood out, the piano presentation. It was supposed to be the highlight of the event. The school had one student who was known for playing the piano. That student had been trained for years and had performed before. The teachers trusted that everything would go smoothly because of that. But sometimes plans don't stay the same. Just a few days before the event, everything shifted. The student who was meant to perform suddenly fell ill. It wasn't something small that could be ignored. The student couldn't come to school, and there was no clear sign of recovery before the event. The news spread quickly among the teachers, and worry replaced confidence. The piano performance could not simply be removed. It had already been announced. Guests were expecting it. The entire program had been built around it. The teachers gathered in a small meeting room, their faces tense. They spoke in low voices, trying to find a solution. Some suggested canceling the performance, but others disagreed. It would leave a gap, and worse, it would make the school seem unprepared. "We need someone else," one of them said firmly. "But who?" another replied. "No one else is trained for this." There was a brief silence. Then, almost as an afterthought, one teacher spoke up. "There is that quiet girl. I've seen her in the music room sometimes." The others looked at each other. "Yes, I've noticed her too," another added. "She plays a little, I think. Maybe basic things." They didn't know much about her. They had never stopped to listen carefully. To them, she was just a student who showed some small interest in the piano. But in that moment of pressure, even a small possibility felt like a solution. "It's better than nothing," one teacher said. "We don't expect perfection. She can just play a simple version of the piece." The decision was made quickly. No one thought to ask her what she could really do. No one thought to give her a choice. Later that day, she was called out of her class. She stood near the staff room, her hands gently holding the edge of her notebook. She didn't know why she had been called. Her mind searched for reasons, wondering if she had done something wrong. One of the teachers stepped forward and spoke in a direct tone. "You've been seen playing the piano," the teacher said. "Is that correct?" The girl hesitated for a second, then nodded softly. "Yes." The teacher didn't smile. "Good. You will be performing at the school event." The words felt heavy. She blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Me?" she asked quietly. "Yes," the teacher replied. "The main performer is unavailable. You will take the place." Her fingers tightened slightly around her notebook. I've never performed before," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "There's no time to worry about that," another teacher added. "You will practice and be ready. It's important." She looked down, her thoughts rushing. Performing in front of a crowd was something she had never imagined. The quiet music room had always been her safe place. There, she could make mistakes, stop, start again. No one was watching. No one was judging. But this was different. "What piece will I play?" she asked carefully. One of the teachers handed her a sheet of music. It looked complicated. Lines and symbols filled the page in a way that made her heart sink for a moment. "This is the piece," the teacher said. "It's already chosen. Just do your best. Do your best." The words sounded simple, but they carried a weight she could feel. She nodded slowly, though inside, her mind was uncertain. That evening, she stayed longer at school than usual. The music room was quiet as always, but this time, it didn't feel like the same place. The piano stood in front of her, familiar yet somehow different. She placed the sheet of music on the stand and looked at it again. It was difficult, much more difficult than anything she had tried before. Her fingers hovered over the keys. For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly she began. The first attempt was not smooth. She paused often, trying to understand the flow. Some parts didn't sound right. She went back and tried again. And again. Time passed without her noticing. The sun began to set, and the room grew dim, but she continued. There was pressure now. Not the kind that came from others, but the kind that grew quietly inside. She didn't want to fail. Not because she was afraid of being scolded, but because something inside her didn't want to leave the music unfinished. Days moved quickly after that. Her routine changed. She spent every free moment in the music room. Before classes, during lunch, after school. Every chance she got, she practiced. Her fingers moved faster. Her understanding deepened. She didn't know the technical terms, didn't follow formal methods, but her ears guided her. Some teachers passed by and heard her. "She's managing," one of them said. "It will be fine." They didn't stay long enough to notice the details. They didn't hear how she was slowly shaping the piece into something more. At home, things were the same as always. Her mother noticed she was coming back later than usual. "You're staying longer at school?" she asked one evening. The girl nodded. "There's an event," she said simply. Her mother smiled faintly. "That's good. Just don't tire yourself too much." The girl nodded again, but she didn't explain further. How could she? The words felt too big to say out loud. As the event came closer, the school became even more active. Decorations were completed. Rehearsals filled every corner, and excitement mixed with nervous energy. But for the girl, everything felt quiet in a different way. Her world had narrowed to the piano, to the piece, to the sound of each note. The teachers believed she would just get through it. They didn't expect anything special. They didn't know what was building beneath the surface. And she didn't fully understand it either. All she knew was that every time she played, something inside her became clearer, stronger, more certain. The stage was waiting. The audience was coming. And without realizing it, the quiet girl who was once unnoticed was slowly walking toward a moment that would change everything. The closer the event came, the heavier everything began to feel for her. First, it had just been a surprise. Then it became something she had to do. But now it was turning into something much bigger. Something she couldn't ignore even if she wanted to. Every morning, when she woke up, the first thing that came to her mind was the piano piece. The notes, the rhythm, the parts she still struggled with, they followed her everywhere. Even while sitting in class, her fingers would move slightly on the desk, tracing invisible keys. But now it wasn't just practice anymore. People had started to notice. One afternoon, while she was practicing in the music room, a group of students passed by. The door was slightly open, and the sound of the piano reached the hallway. They stopped for a moment. "Is someone playing?" one of them asked. They pushed the door a little further and peeked inside. She froze for a second when she saw them. Her fingers slowed, and the flow of the music broke. "Oh, it's her," one of them said, sounding surprised. "I thought someone else was practicing," another added. Their voices weren't loud, but they carried a tone she understood. Doubt. They didn't stay long. After a few seconds, they stepped away, whispering to each other as they left. She sat still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. Then she looked down and started again. But something had changed. Before, the music room felt like her own small world. Now, it felt like a place that could be entered at any moment. A place where someone might listen, judge, or walk away. The next day, more students began to hear about it. "She's the one playing at the event," someone said in the hallway. "Really? But she's never performed before." "Exactly. This is going to be strange." The words spread quietly, but quickly. She didn't hear all of them, but she heard enough. It wasn't that people were being cruel. They were just unsure. And sometimes that kind of doubt felt even heavier than harsh words. In class, she could feel eyes on her more often now. Not many, but enough to make her aware. When she walked through the corridors, a few students would glance at her, then look away. She kept her head down as always. But inside, her thoughts were louder than ever. What if I make a mistake? What if I forget a part? What if I can't finish? The questions came again and again. That evening, she stayed longer than usual in the music room. The sky outside had already turned dark, and the only light in the room came from a single bulb above. She looked at the sheet of music, then at the keys. Her hands felt slightly cold. She placed her fingers on the piano and began to play. At first, the notes came out uneven. Her mind kept interrupting, filling her with doubt. She stopped halfway and took a deep breath. The silence in the room felt thick. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she tried to remember how it felt before all of this. Before the event, before the pressure, before people started watching. Back when it was just her and the piano. Back when she played because she loved the sound. Not because she had to prove anything. She opened her eyes again and started over. This time, she didn't think about the audience. She didn't think about the teachers. She didn't think about the whispers. She just played. Slowly, the tension in her hands began to fade. The notes started to flow more naturally. Her fingers moved with quiet confidence, finding their way across the keys as if they already knew the path. She didn't rush. She didn't force it. She just followed the music. When she reached the difficult part, the one she used to struggle with, she didn't stop. She moved through it carefully, feeling each note instead of fearing it. And she made it through. A small breath escaped her lips. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The next day, one of the teachers came to check on her practice. The girl was already in the music room playing. The teacher stood near the door for a moment, listening. There was a slight pause in the music. Then it continued. "She's improving," the teacher said quietly to another who had just arrived. "Yes," the other replied. "At least she won't completely fail." They didn't mean to sound dismissive, but they didn't realize what they were missing. They stayed for a short while, then left, satisfied that she was good enough. She noticed them, of course, but she didn't stop. She kept playing. Because now, the music wasn't just something she did. It was something she needed. At home, things were becoming harder in small ways. Her mother had started noticing how quiet she had become. "You seem tired," she said one night. The girl smiled softly. "I'm okay." "You're working too hard at school?" She hesitated for a second, then nodded. Her mother reached out and gently touched her head. "Just take care of yourself. That matters more than anything." The girl looked at her, wanting to say more, but the words stayed inside. How could she explain something she didn't fully understand herself? The pressure, the fear, the strange feeling that something important was coming. Days passed, and the final rehearsal was announced. It would be held on the same stage where the event would take place. When she heard this, her heart skipped a beat. The stage. She had seen it before, but only from a distance. Now she would have to sit there, play there, be seen there. On the day of the rehearsal, the hall was mostly empty, but it still felt big. The chairs stretched out in rows, and the stage lights cast a soft glow. The piano stood at the center, waiting. She walked toward it slowly, her steps careful. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at it. Then she sat down. Her hands rested on her lap. The teacher standing nearby gave a small nod. "You can start." She took a breath. Her fingers moved to the keys. The first note echoed through the hall. It sounded different here, louder, clearer, exposed. She continued, trying to stay focused. But halfway through, her fingers slipped. A wrong note, then another. She stopped. The silence felt sharp. "It's okay," the teacher said quickly. "Just continue." She nodded, her face slightly pale, and started again. This time she finished the piece. But it didn't feel the same. When she stood up, her hands felt heavier than before. "Just practice more," the teacher said. "You'll be fine." Fine. The word stayed with her. As she walked back home that day, her steps were slower. The sky above was turning orange, then slowly fading into gray. Her mind replayed the mistake again and again. What if that happens on the real day? What if I stop in the middle? She reached home and sat quietly for a long time. No piano, no sound, just silence. But then, after a while, her fingers began to move lightly on the table. One note, then another. Soft, careful, determined. Because somewhere deep inside, beyond the fear and the doubt, there was something stronger. Something that refused to give up. And even though the world around her still didn't see it clearly, that quiet strength was growing, preparing for the moment when it would finally be heard. The day of the event arrived more quickly than she expected. It didn't feel like a normal morning. Even before the sun fully rose, there was a strange stillness in the air, as if the whole day was waiting for something important to happen. She woke up earlier than usual, her eyes opening before the alarm. For a moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to slow down the thoughts already rushing through her mind. Today, the word echoed inside her. She sat up slowly, her hands resting on her lap. They felt slightly cold, even though the room was not. She rubbed them together gently, as if trying to wake them up. From the other room, she could hear soft movement. Her mother was already awake, preparing for the day. The familiar sounds brought a small sense of comfort. She got ready quietly, wearing her school uniform with extra care. She smoothed out the wrinkles, adjusted her sleeves, and tied her hair neatly. Everything had to be right. Not perfect, she didn't think in those terms, but right enough to feel steady. When she stepped into the main room, her mother looked at her for a moment and smiled. "You're ready early," she said. "There's an event at school," the girl replied softly. Her mother nodded. "You'll do well." The girl paused slightly. She didn't ask how her mother knew that. She just held on to the words. The walk to school felt different that day. The streets were the same, the houses unchanged, but something inside her made everything feel sharper, more real. She noticed the small sounds, the distant voices, the rustle of leaves, the rhythm of her own footsteps. When she reached the school gate, she saw decorations hanging across the entrance. Bright colors carefully placed, welcoming guests. Students moved around quickly, some carrying items, others rehearsing their parts even at the last moment. There was energy everywhere. Excitement, nervousness, expectation. She stepped inside quietly, as she always did, but today, she could feel the difference. People were more alert, more aware. Even the teachers seemed more serious, their voices more focused. She made her way toward the music room. It was her place, her calm space. When she entered, the familiar sight of the piano greeted her. For a moment, everything else faded. She walked up to it and gently touched the keys. A soft note filled the room. She closed her eyes, just for a second. Then she began to play. It wasn't a full performance, not the entire piece. Just parts of it. The beginning, a difficult section, the ending. Her fingers moved carefully, warming up, remembering, settling. Outside, the school grew louder as guests began to arrive. Inside, she stayed focused. A little later, a teacher came in. "It's almost time," the teacher said. The girl nodded, her hands pausing. "Come with me." She stood up slowly, taking one last look at the piano before following. The hall was already filling up. Rows of chairs were occupied by students, parents, and visitors. Soft conversations filled the space, mixing into a low hum. The stage lights were brighter than during rehearsal, casting a warm glow over everything. She stood near the side of the stage, partially hidden from view. From there, she could see the audience. Felt bigger than before. Much bigger. Her heartbeat quickened. On stage, one performance ended, followed by applause. Then another began. Time moved forward, steady and unstoppable. Her turn was getting closer. A teacher stood beside her, holding a clipboard. "Be ready," the teacher said. She nodded. Her hands felt cold again. She pressed them together gently, trying to steady herself. Then, her name was called. The sound of it seemed to echo through the hall. For a moment, everything felt quiet. Then the teacher gave a small signal. It was time. She stepped onto the stage. The light felt stronger here, almost blinding at first. She couldn't clearly see the faces in the audience, just shapes and movement. But she knew they were there, watching, waiting. She walked toward the piano, each step careful, controlled. When she reached it, she paused for a brief second. Then she sat down. The bench felt firm beneath her. The piano stood in front of her, larger than it had ever seemed before. She placed her hands on her lap. The hall was silent now, completely silent. She took a deep breath, then another. Slowly, she lifted her hands and placed her fingers on the keys. For a moment, she didn't move. Her mind was full. What if I make a mistake? What if I stop? What if... She closed her eyes, just like she had done before in the music room. And in that moment, something shifted. The noise in her mind softened. The fear didn't disappear, but it moved aside, making space for something else. Something familiar. The sound of the piano. The feeling of the keys beneath her fingers. The quiet connection she had built over time. She opened her eyes and began. The first note rang out, clear and steady. Then the next, and the next. Her fingers moved slowly at first, careful, controlled. The hall remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not empty, listening. As she continued, something inside her settled. The notes began to flow more naturally. Her hands relaxed. The rhythm found its place. She wasn't thinking about the audience anymore. She wasn't thinking about the teachers. She wasn't thinking about the rehearsal. She was just playing. The music grew stronger, filling the hall. Each note carried feeling, not just sound. There was a softness in some parts, a quiet emotion that reached beyond the keys. Then, in other moments, there was strength, a confidence that surprised even her. Her fingers moved across the piano with ease. Not perfect, but real. When she reached the difficult section, the one that had troubled her before, there was a brief moment of tension. But she didn't stop. She didn't hesitate. She moved through it, trusting herself. And she made it. The music continued, building toward the end. In the audience, people sat still. Some leaned forward slightly. Some exchanged quiet glances. The teachers, who had expected a simple performance, now watched with growing surprise. This was not what they had imagined. Not at all. Back on stage, she was no longer aware of any of that. Her world had narrowed again. To the piano. To the music. To the feeling that had guided her from the very beginning. The final notes approached. Her hands moved with calm certainty. And then, the last note. It echoed softly, then faded into silence. For a brief moment, nothing happened. No movement. No sound. Just stillness. Her hands remained on the keys, her breathing steady. Then slowly, she lifted her fingers. The silence held for one more second. And in that moment, something had already changed. Even if no one had spoken yet, even if no one had moved, something had shifted in the room, and it would not go unnoticed. For a moment after the final note faded, the hall stayed completely still. It was not the kind of silence people notice right away. It was deeper than that, almost like everyone needed a second to understand what they had just heard. The sound of the piano had ended, but something of it still seemed to hang in the air. She sat there quietly, her hands slowly moving away from the keys. Her heart was still beating fast, but her mind felt strangely calm. She didn't look up immediately. She didn't rush. She just took a small breath, as if returning from somewhere far away. Then it happened. A single clap. It came from somewhere in the middle of the audience. Soft at first, almost unsure. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire hall filled with applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It wasn't forced. It was real, strong, loud. The kind that rises naturally when people feel something they didn't expect. She looked up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the light. The faces in the audience were clearer now. Some people were smiling. Some looked surprised. A few were even whispering to each other while still clapping. The teachers sitting near the front exchanged glances. This was not what they had prepared for. One of them leaned slightly toward another and said quietly, "Did you hear that?" The other nodded, still watching the girl on stage. That was far beyond what we thought. There was no disbelief in the tone, only realization. Back on stage, she stood up slowly. Her hands rested gently by her sides. She didn't know what to do next. The applause continued, filling the hall, growing even louder. For a second, she thought it might stop quickly. But it didn't. Kept going. She gave a small, uncertain nod, the kind that came naturally when she didn't know how to respond. Then she turned and began to walk off the stage. Each step felt lighter than before. Not because everything was suddenly easy, but because something inside her had shifted. She had done it. Not perfectly, not without fear, but she had done it. As she reached the side of the stage, one of the teachers stepped forward quickly. That was... The teacher paused, searching for the right words. That was very good. The girl lowered her eyes slightly. Thank you. Another teacher joined, still looking a bit surprised. Where did you learn to play like that? The teacher asked. The girl hesitated. I just practiced, she said softly. The teachers exchanged another glance. Just practiced. The words sounded simple, but now they carried a different meaning. They realized they had never really asked before. They had assumed. They had decided based on what little they thought they knew. And they had been wrong. Meanwhile, the next performance was already being prepared on stage. But the energy in the hall had changed. People were still talking about what they had just seen. Was that the girl who replaced the main performer? Yes, I think so. She played better than expected. Better? That was amazing. The words moved quietly from one person to another. Not loud enough to interrupt the program, but clear enough to spread. The girl stood near the side, slightly behind the curtain. She could still hear the applause fading in her mind, even though the hall had moved on. Her hands, which had felt so cold before, were now warm. She looked down at them for a moment. The same hands, the same fingers, but now they felt different. Not stronger, not different in any physical way, just known. As if she had finally understood something about herself that had always been there. A little later, when the program paused for a short break, one of the senior teachers approached her. You should come with me, the teacher said gently. The girl followed without question. They walked through the hallway, away from the noise of the hall, into a quieter space. The teacher stopped and turned toward her. Tell me honestly, the teacher said, have you had any formal training? The girl shook her head. No. The teacher studied her face for a moment, trying to understand. No classes? No instructor? No, she repeated softly. Then how? The question didn't finish. The girl didn't have a clear answer. I just listen, she said after a moment. And then I try. The teacher let out a slow breath. There was something sincere in her words. No pride, no attempt to impress, just truth. You have a gift, the teacher said quietly. The girl didn't respond, not because she disagreed, but because she had never thought about it that way. Gift. The word felt unfamiliar. Back in the hall, the program resumed, but for many, the highlight had already passed. When the event finally ended, people began to leave, but not without talking about the performance again. Near the exit, a few parents spoke to the teachers. That girl who played the piano, who is she? One asked. She's one of our students, the teacher replied. She should continue, another added. She has something special. The teachers nodded, their earlier confidence replaced with a different kind of awareness. They had seen it now. They couldn't ignore it anymore. Outside, the evening air felt cooler. The sky had already begun to darken. The girl walked out of the school gate, just like she always did. No crowd around her. No big moment. Just her quiet steps on the same path she had taken every day. But inside her, everything felt different. The weight she had carried before was gone. In its place was something lighter. Not excitement. Not pride. Just a calm sense of knowing. She reached home and pushed the door open gently. Her mother looked up. You're back, she said, smiling. How was the event? The girl paused for a second. Then she smiled softly. It was good. Her mother nodded. I knew it would be. The girl sat down quietly, her hands resting on her lap again. But this time they didn't move nervously. They stayed still, calm, certain. Because somewhere along the way, without making a big announcement, without trying to prove anything, she had shown something that no one expected. And even though the world around her was only beginning to notice, a quiet truth had already been revealed. She was no longer just the unnoticed girl in the back of the class. She was something more, and this time people had heard it. The next morning did not feel as quiet as the ones before. Something had changed even though the school looked exactly the same. The same gate, the same classrooms, the same morning bell. But the way people moved, the way they looked around, the way they spoke, it all carried a small difference. When she walked through the gate, she noticed it right away. A few students glanced at her. Not quickly and then away like before. This time they looked a little longer. Not in a bad way. Just noticing. She lowered her eyes slightly, as she always did, and continued walking. Her steps were calm, but inside, she felt that same quiet awareness again. The feeling that something had shifted, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. In the classroom, things were not exactly the same either. As she took her usual seat at the back, one of the students in front turned slightly and looked at her. You played yesterday, right? The student asked. Her hands paused for a second on her desk. She nodded softly. Yes. You played really well, the student said, then turned back around without making a big deal of it. The girl sat still for a moment. The words were simple, but they stayed with her. More students began to talk about the event. Not loudly, not all at once, but in small conversations that moved around the room. The piano performance was the best part. I didn't expect that at all. Who knew she could play like that? She didn't join in those conversations. She just listened quietly, just like she always had. But now, instead of feeling invisible, she felt included, in a quiet way. Later that day, a teacher came into the classroom and called her name. Come with me for a moment, the teacher said. She stood up and followed, her mind wondering what it might be about. They walked to the same staff room where she had once been told to perform. But this time, the feeling was different. The teacher's tone was softer, more thoughtful. Inside the room, two other teachers were already there. They looked at her, not with urgency or expectation like before, but with something closer to respect. Sit down, one of them said gently. She sat, her hands resting neatly in her lap. There was a brief silence before one of the teachers spoke. We've been talking about your performance, the teacher said. The girl listened quietly. It was not just good, the teacher continued. It was something we did not expect. She didn't respond. She wasn't sure what to say. "Why didn't you tell us you could play like that?" another teacher asked. The question was not harsh. It was curious. The girl thought for a moment. "I didn't know," she said softly. The teachers looked at each other. "You didn't know?" one repeated. She shook her head slightly. "I just play." The simplicity of her answer filled the room. There was no explanation, no long story, no attempt to impress. Just honesty. One of the teachers leaned back slightly. "Well," the teacher said, "we think you should continue." The girl looked up. "Continue?" she asked. "Yes," the teacher replied. "With proper guidance. Training. You have potential, and it should not be left unnoticed." The word potential felt new, but not uncomfortable. "What do I need to do?" she asked quietly. "We will arrange it," the teacher said. "For now, just keep practicing. But this time, you won't be doing it alone." She nodded slowly. Something about that felt different. Not being alone. It was not something she was used to. When she left the room, her steps were steady. The hallway felt the same, but her place in it did not. Later, during lunch, she went to the music room again. The door creaked as it opened, just like always. The piano stood there, unchanged. Familiar. Waiting. She walked toward it and sat down. For a moment, she didn't play. She just looked at the keys. Everything that had happened, the event, the applause, the conversations, it all felt distant compared to this simple moment. Her fingers rested gently on the keys. Then she began. The first notes were soft, calm, just like before. But there was something new in the way she played. Not louder, not more complex, just clearer. As if she understood what she was doing in a deeper way now. Not just repeating sounds, but expressing something. The room filled with music once again. But this time the door stayed open, and someone was listening. A teacher stood quietly near the entrance, not interrupting, not stepping inside, just listening, noticing, understanding. The days that followed brought small changes one by one. She was given more time in the music room. Sometimes a teacher would sit nearby and guide her gently. Nothing strict, nothing overwhelming, just small suggestions, small corrections. She listened carefully, just like she always had. But now she had direction. At home, her mother began to see the difference too. Not in big ways, but in small ones. The girl seemed more focused, more certain. One evening, her mother sat beside her. "You've been smiling more," she said softly. The girl looked at her, a little surprised. "Have I?" she asked. Her mother nodded. "Yes, something good has happened." The girl thought for a moment. Then she gave a small nod. "Yes," she said. She didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. Some things could be felt without being spoken. Weeks passed, and her connection with music grew stronger. She was no longer just exploring. She was learning, understanding, growing. The girl who once played in silence now carried something more within her. Not confidence in the loud, obvious way, but a quiet belief, a steady knowing. She still sat at the back of the class, still walked quietly through the halls, still spoke softly. But now, when she touched the piano, there was no hesitation, no doubt, just music. And people had started to listen, not because she asked them to, but because they wanted to. One afternoon, as she finished playing, she paused and looked at her hands. The same hands that once trembled. The same fingers that once searched for the right notes. Now they moved with ease. Not perfect, but certain. She took a slow breath and smiled. Just a little. Because without trying to prove anything, without asking for attention, she had found something that belonged to her. Something that had always been there. And now it was no longer hidden. The quiet girl who once sat unnoticed had become someone people remembered. Not for being loud. Not for standing out in a crowd. But for something deeper. Something real. And as she sat in the music room, with soft light falling across the old piano, one thing was clear. This was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning.